In essence, what are the fundamental aspects of Christian, of Christian belief? Now, let me make it very clear from over here. We have spent a considerable amount of time understanding some of the basic sodas of Yahadus, especially of certain many critical concepts. We have attempted to understand the whole tachlis of the Bria, basically, the anhogas of the Bria, the hashkochas of the two anhogas, anhogas hamishpat and anhogas yichud. We have attempted to understand basically the concept of the hasagas yichudoi and the concept of the of namak supa, of bachira. We spoke about the concept of the hashkocha throughout history, the hanhogas hayichud as it manifests itself in tiboyer salah, the concept of Ra, the Sultan. Many of these things we spoke about, and then finally, all this stuff began to come together when we began to speak about the concept of the Trei Mashiachim, which are the two tikkunim of the entire Bria. With all this as a background, and having listened to all this before, we can now attempt to do something in a way which can be productive, which cannot be really attacked prior to all the information you know from before. What we want to understand is, only briefly in a sense, not exhaustively, some of the doctrines of Christianity and why it is that these doctrines are completely false. Now, there are two problems with Christianity, two basic problems. The first problem with Christianity is that why Christianity is false as a religion. As a religion, in other words, it's false in terms of its source, where it comes from. When we say that Christianity is false, we say this for two reasons. One reason why Christianity is false is because of where its origin, its source, where it takes the doctrine from. That's the first reason why it's false. There's a tremendous question on the validity of the origin of Christianity itself. The second reason why it's false is not so much the origin, but rather its theology, or the concepts that it attempts to espouse. You see. So therefore, when we're trying to analyze Christianity, you can analyze Christianity from two stardom, in terms of its origin, and in terms of its philosophy, or its machshava. We will not go so much into the reasons why Christianity is false from its origin. Suffice it to say, only one point about that. Most of the share that I want to speak about is the falsehood of Christianity in terms of its philosophy. Because, why is that important? It's much easier to see the falsehood of Christianity from its origin than from its philosophy. Why is that? Because the philosophy is very subtle. There are many, many things which exist in Christian theology which have been borrowed from Judaism. You see, it's been borrowed and it's been distorted. And that's one reason why many times it's very difficult to see where the false Christ lies. And to somebody who doesn't know Hashkafa or what it is, he can, chas v'shalom, fall into a trap of machshava. So we're going to cover that specifically. Let's first talk about the origin of Christianity itself. Why is it that Christianity fundamentally is a total sheker? For one basic reason. Well, there are really two reasons. Two reasons why. Number one, where does Christianity come from? Where does the entire tradition of Christianity come from? It comes from the experience, basically, of several people, 2 or 3 people. That's all it comes from. Who fundamentally say that there existed a certain time, 2,000 years ago, a man who arose, who actually was Jewish, and who arose in Israel, whose name was Yeshu, or Jesus, and that he arose and he created basically a new religion. Now, there's big machlokes in themselves on what he actually said. But basically, what Christians believe, and they believe this through what's called later on, well, let me just say just something about a little about the history of Christianity itself. When Christianity first started, basically it was a belief that Jesus was a Mashiach. That's how it really started out. They believed that he was a Mashiach, you see. And basically what happened was there was a cult that formed around this concept that Jesus was the Mashiach. Later on, this thing became much wider and began to be built around a new cult. And that cult that not only was Jesus the Mashiach, but Jesus himself was an aspect of God. So they took an individual who they first said was a Mashiach, and then later on they decided that this person himself is an Inyan of Elokus. They elevated the thing substantially. You see. Now, the one who did that, the one who really created Christianity as we know it today, in the sense that Jesus was an Elokus and so on, and that in dying on the cross and dying at the hands of the Romans, he died for the sins of mankind. This fundamentally was created, well, in a number of ways, but the one who really promoted the Shita was, the guy who really promoted was Paul. Christianity as it is today is really called Paulinism, and it's based fundamentally on his doctrine. There was a tremendous machlokes in the time of early origins of Christianity on what the nature of Christianity is itself. And there was a very big machlokes between Paul and Peter, whether or not Christianity is something that should go up to all the Goyim, or Christianity is something which should remain among the Jews themselves, at least in this little sect, and so on. There was a very big machlokes. And what fundamentally Peter said, and Peter was supposed to be the greatest Talmud of Jesus, he said that Christianity, the belief in Jesus as a Mashiach, must remain with the Jews as a cult. And that even in order to become a Christian, you first have to be Jewish. Nobody can be a Christian unless he first was a Yid. That's what Peter said. And Paul told him that that's not Shayach. If you're going to do it that way, Christianity will eventually die. You see. If you want to really build it up to something, you've got to promote it among all the Goyim also. In order to do that, you have to make it a religion which is palatable to the Goyim as well. So what Paul basically began to do was began to say that all of the Torah and all of the Taryag mitzvahs is unnecessary. All you have to do is believe in the person of Jesus himself, that he is the Mashiach and that he is an Elokus, right? And you yourself will obtain perfection. You will obtain Olam Haba, the kingdom of heaven. In order to do that, by doing that, what he did was he made Christianity now accessible to all the Goyim, because no longer does a Goy have to adhere to the Taryag mitzvahs. You see. So Paul drastically changed the whole concept of Christianity, the entire face of it. We're not going to go into the whole history and so on. It's really something of progressive stages and so on of Christianity. It's a very strange kind of thing and so on. Fundamentally, why is it that we Jews do not believe in Jesus, number one, in terms of the origins? And why is it that Jews would rather die than accept that belief? Because fundamentally, for one main reason, its origin is totally false. What is its origin? Its origin is that a person came up and said that which is said in the Torah is no longer true. That God has absolved mankind or the Jews from doing Torah, and he has exonerated them. That the Banishim said to especially to the Jews, you no longer have to keep the Taryag mitzvahs. Just believe in this individual called Jesus, who is my son, and if you believe in him, that's enough. That's enough for your salvation. This to all of us is an absolute sheker. Why? Because why do we believe in the Torah? And I want to give a long shir on this a while back. What's the essence of the Emunah in Torah itself? It's the Kabbalah and Har Sinai. Basically what happened is that in the time of Yetzias Mitzrayim, 600,000 people experienced Matan Torah together, because they all heard the first two mitzvahs up in Nevi'us. They all experienced Nevi'us together with Moshe Rabbeinu. They even believed that the Torah is from the Banishim, not because Moshe told it to them at all, you see. Because Moshe had no validity to tell them, basically, because the Jews said to him, how do we know that what you're saying is true? How do we know that you didn't write this Torah? Fundamentally, the Jews believe that the Torah is from the Banishim because they all experienced the Nevi'us themselves, along with Moshe Rabbeinu. That's how all of Klal Yisrael knew that it's the Banishim who says the Torah. This is the first thing. The second thing is that the Torah was given to the entire nation of Israel, so that we find that the Matan Torah was a national experience. The giving of the Torah on Har Sinai was a national experience that was experienced by all the Jews at that time. And it was experienced individually by all the Jews at that time. And that national experience was then passed down as a national tradition, something which exists in the consciousness of the nation of Israel itself. That there was once a time, there was a generation which experienced the giving of the Torah, the revelation of Torah from the Banishim himself. We all have that as a basic tradition. Comes along a person 1300 years later by the name of Jesus, or Paul, however you want to do it, it doesn't really matter, and says that this Torah which you're listening to is false. That's what that person says. Why? Because I say to you that the Baruch Shem has told me that we can absolve you from the Tayag mitzvahs. Now, a Fumiyid goes over to the guy and says, wait a minute, I have the Kabbalah, the tradition, that the Baruch Shem was Mitzvah Chayazol Tayag mitzvahs, and none of that, he was Mitzvah Tayag mitzvahs ad olam, and there will not be a change. You come and you tell me that the Baruch Shem has changed his mind. I want to ask you, how do you know? So the man would say, I received such an avias, or I received such an event. So we say to him the following, we don't know about your navias. Navias is totally a subjective event. How do we know what you heard and what you saw? You see, we have no idea. None of us shared your navias at all. It's a personal experience. But we know from the Kabbalah of all our generations that the navias of Moshe Rabbeinu was true because it was experienced by all of Christ along with him. So we know that this is an emes, and we have this for Kabbalah from generation to generation to generation. We know that such a thing happened. You see, so it's a question. It's you versus the Rabbim. It's Yochid the Rabbim here. There are 600,000 witnesses that it says in the Torah that the Torah is emes. One of the things that the Torah says is about a Navi Sheker. It says that if a Navi comes up in Klal Yisrael, mind you, a Navi who has the ability to mamish to see the future, and he says to Klal Yisrael that I tell you that you're supposed to give up some of your mitzvahs. You have to absolve yourself from the mitzvahs and so on and so forth. That person is a Navi Sheker. We have to stone him. Why is he a Navi Sheker? Because the answer is, such a thing is impossible. The Baruch Shem said that this Torah will remain forever. No one can ever contradict it. If a person comes up later on and says that he's a Navi, it's impossible. Because the Baruch Shem would never do such a thing. And therefore it remains a question of his Navias versus the Navias of Moshe and of all Klal Yisrael. The Navias of one man cannot contradict or countermand the Navias of 600,000 people. That's how we know that this man is absolutely false. Because since the Navias of Moshe and all of Klal Yisrael said that this Torah will never change, and that if a man arises in Klal Yisrael that tries to change it, he is false, we know therefore that you're false. So automatically, that tells us why Christianity is false from its origin. It is impossible for someone to arise today and tell us that the Baruch Shem changed his mind, or changed the Ummah of Klal Yisrael for somebody else. That is an impossibility. And the Torah itself says that that person is a Navi Sheker. This is why, basically, Christianity is false from its roots. Its origin is false. Because no Navi can countermand the experience and tradition of an entire nation. That's why Jews have never accepted Jesus or anything after that. And they would rather die that because it's Mamash Avodah Zarah. You see, that's the reason why Christianity is false from its origin. But the question is something else. Christianity has certain shittas. And the question is, let's examine some of those shittas and see why Christianity is false from its theology or its philosophy itself. What I just told you is a very critical thing. And let me summarize it again. If any person, any Goy or any Christian, or unfortunately, any Jews for Jesus comes over and tells you about this Christianity thing, and he says to you, why don't you believe in this Christianity? The essential answer that you have to give, which is the essential answer to the whole thing, is the following. Your Jesus is no better than a Navi Sheker. He's no better than a Navi Sheker. Because your Jesus is telling us a certain thing. He's telling us that the Torah has been cancelled and removed, you see. The Torah calls that a Navi Sheker. And that experience, and that the only cause that he would have to say that is that if he says that he talked to Baruch Shem, he would have to be a Navi to say such a thing. And we don't know about this Navias because his Navias is subjective. The only way we can know about his Navias is by subjecting him to a certain certification process. But no matter what he says, he must be false. Because the experience of one man, which is open to question, cannot negate the experience of an entire nation, which is not open to question, because the entire nation experienced that. And we have that the Kabbalah, you see.
What about if he was
and that's, you see. And what you say to the Christian is the following, because Christians hold the following. They hold that the Torah, which they call the Old Testament, is true. It's 100% emes. They hold that the whole Torah and Moshe Rabbeinu and Klal Yisrael are 100% emes. Except that they hold that in the time of Jesus, the Banishim decided to change the Machleb, the Ummah, with another nation, and remove the Indian of Torah just to believe in Jesus, you see. Which means that they hold that the same God who gave the Torah is the God who belongs in the partnership with Jesus. You see, the same God, you see. So the question that you ask them is the following, basically, is that if God knew at the time of Matan Torah, according to you, that La'asad Lavo, he's going to change his mind, which he must have known, you see, and bring down another person, in this case who you say is his son, you see, why would he, and therefore tell that person who is Jesus to negate the Torah? Why would he put in the Torah now, by the time of Matan Torah, that anyone who comes up to negate the Torah is a Navi Sheker? Uzchayev Skila. You see the point? Why would he do it now? If it's his intention to bring forth 1,000 years later a man called Jesus, who he wants to become the salvation of man and that we should all believe in him, how does he expect the Jews to believe in him when he himself, the Banishim himself, writes now that we're not supposed to believe in him, you see? Why does he do that? How can you say to a Christian, how do you Christian expect me to believe in, in your Jesus, you see, when your God, the one you consider God, himself told me not to believe in Jesus. So if the Christian says, where did God say you're not to believe in Jesus? You tell him, God told me not to believe in Jesus because of the Pasha of Navi Sheker. That's where it is. You see. So that itself is totally ridiculous and absurd. This is the fundamental chakras of Christianity. And that's the only answer you have to give. And that's it. You don't have to argue with the guy on psukim, which is shtusim, because many of them will attempt to distort the psukim. You see, there are many psukim that they attempt to distort and so on. You don't have to deal with those psukim because you distort here, distort here, that's irrelevant. You don't even have to argue them on theology or philosophy about the shita of Christianity. It's not necessary. The fundamentally absurd why it's a sheker because it has no shirish, it has no roots. Christianity is a total aberration because it contradicts the Messiah of Klal Yisrael of the Banishim himself in terms of what we experience from Matan Torah, a Nevi'us of 600,000 people. That's it. So therefore the very origin is false. Nothing really more need be said. And this is why we have to go into many of their concepts of the Goyim are really taken from Eden. They're really concepts that exist in Ashkafa, except they've taken it for their own usage and distorted it. That's what I'd like to discuss now. Now that we see basically that the origin of Christianity is false, the question here is the theology, some of the basic principles. Okay, let's go into it. What are some of the basic principles of Christianity in that kind of sense? Number one, there existed, the world at that time had reached a tremendous level of hate up to that time. Because of that, the Banishim decided that the only way to save mankind, to save them from their sin, is by taking a piece of himself in a way and bringing it down to the world in the form of a person. That person is Jesus. And what he did was, he took that person, he took a piece of Elokus, brought him down into a human personality and into a guf, and saw to it in such a way that that person would attempt to be makar people, but that he eventually would die and experience the end of death. And by experiencing death, in other words, by God killing a piece of himself, as you might say, that would be a kapora on all of mankind. That would be a kapora of all of mankind, and it would remove the blemish of the chet on all of mankind. That's what they say. In other words, number one, man had achieved a certain level of chet, which is needed a very unique type of kapora. Number two, the only thing that can take a kapora was that the Banishim himself had to be mechapa on the bria. That's what they say. And then how do you do that? By taking a piece of that and going down into the form of a person, and that person would die like a korban dies, like a korban chata on oila, and the death of that piece of himself, or that piece of Elokus, would be mechapa on the world to erase the whole chet of the bria, and so on. However, there is one condition. The only way that miraculous process can happen to you is if you believe in the process itself. You see, that's the whole thing. If you believe that this process happened, you see, if you believe that Jesus did die on the cross for all the people, that itself brings you the total salvation. So your emunah is your Yeshua. That's basically what it is. Not only that, it is no longer necessary. It's no longer necessary to Mekayim any Tayyag mitzvahs. Because the Torah is no more critical anymore. All the Tayyag mitzvahs are only important up to a certain point in time. But since Klal Yisrael failed to keep the Tayyag mitzvahs in their way, the Buddhism said, look, I'm taking the job away from you. I'm taking the job of creating an Olam Haba away from you, and I'm giving it to all the people of the world. But I'm going to change the entire tzur of that job. No longer do you have to get Olam Haba by keeping the Tayyag mitzvahs, but you have to get Olam Haba by believing in the process in which I'm about to do. And what is that process? That a piece of myself will be sacrificed in human form, and that will be mechaper for all of you. Your belief in that will from now on give you Olam Haba. That's basically the Shita of the Christians. Now, there are certain Jewish concepts in that Shita. Number one, the concept that the Banishim, in order to save the Bria, you see, puts himself in a very strange position, in a position of difficulty, of turbulence, is taka, a Jewish concept. That's the concept of the Shechina. The Shechina b'serich HaKlippos. We all know that, at a certain point in the world, by the Chet of Adam Rishon, and especially by Noach, by the marvel, the Shechina went into the Klippa. That's the whole Indian of the rainbow. You see, that's why it says that it's also to be mistakel on the rainbow. It's also to be mistakel on the colors of the rainbow. That's what it says. Why? Because the rainbow symbolizes the covenant or the bris that the Banishim made with Noach, that he would no longer destroy the world. But what that rainbow also symbolizes is not only the bris, but it symbolizes the process behind that bris. The only way the Banishim was able to be maftiach to Adam, that I will not destroy the world, is when the Shechina goes into the Klippa. When the Shechina goes into the Klippa and goes through that turbulence, that is the kapora for the Bria, so the male of the world is no longer destroyed. So that's why you cannot be mistaken on the rainbow. Why? Because to look at the rainbow is to look at the busha of the Shechina. The rainbow is a symbol of the bris, but it's also a symbol of the bezoyan, that the Shechina has to lie to Mekayim the Bria. Which is a very interesting thing. That's why it says that one of the simonim that the Mashiach is about to appear is that people will see the rainbow unusually clear, in its incredible clarity. Its colors will be extremely clear, you see, which symbolizes the fact that the Shechina is just about to come out of the Klippa, in that sense. But until that comes along, you cannot be mistakel on anything. You cannot be mistakel on the simon of the bezoyan of the Shechina, because the bezoyan of the Shechina is the hatzol of the Bria. So l'chayla, according to that, which is a Jewish concept, l'chayla we see an interesting thing. You see, we see taka that this Indian doesn't exist. You see, so taka, why is Jesus so different? He's supposed to be an aspect of Elokus, which taka was machap on the Bria. Even if we say that Jesus was not an Indian of Elokus, but Jesus was a tzaddik, and as a tzaddik he was miskap on the Bria. We also find that in what do you call it? We find that when tzaddikim die, they bring the kapor on the world. It's an often Gemara, it's often. You see, that the misasim shel tzaddikim, a machapa for the Bria. We find such a zach, that tzaddikim attack gobonis. In fact, Rav was mispal to the Banishim and said, if you need a korban for the Bria, make me the korban. So we find that concept is not an alien concept either. The fact that the Christians say that the Banishim wanted to change the whole tzur of Klal Yisrael and abandon Klal Yisrael and go to the other Ummos Olam and let them create the kingdom of heaven, which is Olam Haba, is also not alien. Why? Because that's exactly what the Banishim did in the time of Avram. When the Banishim said to Avram Avinu, what did the Banishim say after Avram? The Banishim said to Avram that I will build for you a special nation, an Am Skula, that they will be the replacement of Adam Rishon. And what about all the nations of the world, the Shiv Mumats? They will no longer have Shaykh to Olam Haba. You see. So we do see that sometimes the Banishim does, you see, transfer this kind of thing. We do see that. In fact, we saw that by Moshe Rabbeinu itself. The Banishim said, let me destroy this Ummah by the Chet of the Egel, and let me make another Ummah from you. Let me do that. So in other words, we see that fundamentally some of the points that the Christians do say seem to have certain basis in Yiddishkeit. So the question is, what is the theological fallacy of Christianity? Why is it sheker metoich its philosophy, besides metoich its origin? How shall we answer this and look in this? How shall we answer some of these questions? Okay, fundamentally, what does Yiddishkeit say about these things? First of all, what is the Shekhinah? What is the Shekhinah? That's number one. When we say that the Shekhinah goes b'serach HaKlippos, what are we talking about? Let me make it very clear now that the Shekhinah is not the Rebbeinu Shalom. The Shekhinah is not Elokim. What is the Shekhinah? The Shekhinah represents an aspect of his hashpor. That's what it is. The Shekhinah is an union of a shefa. It's the shefa of Olam Haba. It's a shefa. It's the way that he relates to the Nevoim. It's the shefa that he has in store for them. The particular shefa that he has in store for them, which will give them their hatava. But it is not him. It is his shefa. When we say that the Shekhinah is b'serach HaKlippos, he is not b'serach HaKlippos. It's not a klippa is a nivra. A bore cannot be into the rishus of a nivra. What we have made very clear a long time ago is the essence of the Rebbeinu Shalom is that what? That he himself is existence. The Rebbeinu Shalom does not possess existence. He is existence itself. He is the existence itself. Existence is the entity. Not only that, his type of existence is such that it is beyond concept, because it's not even subject to an essence. I don't want to go into this whole thing that we went before we had the whole shiur about what this means. It is impossible for a being who is pure existence itself to become dominated by something which possesses existence and which needs him for its existence. The Rebbeinu Shalom cannot be imprisoned or cannot be under the domination or under the shlita of that which needs the Rebbeinu Shalom for its existence. That's an absolute absurdity. You see, the Rebbeinu Shalom gives mitzvahs to everything, including the Shekhinah. The Shekhinah is nothing more than a shefa. It's a shpor to the world, which will be come down in Olam Haba. That's what the Shekhinah is. When we say that the Rebbeinu Shalom put the Shekhinah in the Klippa, what it means is that he took his shefa and he put the shefa into the Klippa, so that the Klippa or the Satan is yoinik from that shefa. That's what it means. It doesn't mean that the Satan has the Rebbeinu Shalom in captivity. What it does mean is that he has the shefa of the Rebbeinu Shalom in captivity. The shefa was designed to give to man in Olam Haba. That's in captivity. And because that's in captivity, the Satan is able to be yoinik, or to be able to fortify and strengthen himself from being yoinik on that shefa. And that's obviously the greatest shefa of all. The shefa of the Shekhinah, the Metzias of that shefa, is the most powerful shefa that exists. And that's what the Klippa, that's what the Satan is yoinik from. So therefore, when the Christians say that Jesus is God, they're not talking about a shefa. The Goyim believe in what's called the Trinity. That God has three aspects to him. What's called God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Those are three chalakim of him. And they learn it out in their New Testament, and so on. That, what do you call it, that there are three aspects to an Elokim is impossible. Because the Rebbeinu Shalom is beyond the number. Like we said before, the Rebbeinu Shalom is beyond plurality. Because all plurality and all number itself is a nivra. Because all of it contains an essence, you see, which all possess existence. The Rebbeinu Shalom is beyond number. Even when we say Hashem Echad, doesn't mean the Rebbeinu Shalom is one. Let's say like a chair is one. You see, when we say the Rebbeinu Shalom is one, we say Eino Id Malvado means that his unity is such that he is identical with himself. That's what Hashem Echad means. Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad means that the Rebbeinu Shalom is one because he is identical with himself, so there is nothing outside of him. He and his existence are the same thing. That's the greatest amount of Achdus. That's absolute unity. You see? So therefore it is impossible for the Rebbeinu Shalom to have three different chalakim in it. You may say, so what did the Christians say on this? They themselves know, the greatest Christian philosophers, notably Thomas Aquinas, who is probably the greatest of all the Christian philosophers. How do they answer themselves? They answer it in one way. They call the Trinity the mystery of the Holy Trinity. Why is it a mystery? Because they have no answer. That's why. and that's the Yesod Gadol in Catholicism and all Christianity. The Trinity, which is the most fundamental ikar of all Christianity, they say remains an absolute mystery, because it is beyond hasaga, how there can be one God and three gods at the same time. You see, and we answer that, of course it's a mystery. It's a mystery because it's an absurdity. It's impossible. It's a mystery which has no answer or solution, because the essence of the mystery itself is ridiculous. That's what the Rambam says, and all the Rishonim, and everyone sits them. It's obvious from the thing. That's number one. So that Jesus should be an Elokim, one aspect of a God, is absolutely ridiculous. But that's one part of the thing. The other part is that God should take a piece of his Elokus and put it incarnate into a human body is the most incredible feat of all. You see, for a Borei, which is existence itself, to incarnate himself into a Metzias, which possesses existence, you see, and which is not synonymous with itself, is an absolute impossibility. It's like the Bunisher would make himself into a Nivra. How can the Borei be a Nivra at the same time? That's impossible. Because the definition of a Nivra is what? Is that he needs a Banisham. The definition of a Nivra, the essence of a Nivra, is Yeshod Mavadai. There is something else besides a Nivra, because something else possesses another essence and another existence. But the Banisham is Einod Mavadai. There is no other essence, there is no other Metzias but him, because he is the sum total of existence itself. He has that thing called existence itself. He has it in the sense that it is him. It's his essence. So there's nothing outside of that. So therefore, that's the thing. So the Elokus, what they call the Elokus of Jesus, is a total absurdity, because first of all, there cannot be a three-way Elokus in Rochnius, and there can't be an Elokus in Gashmius. The whole thing doesn't start, and it's Christians themselves are moida that it is a total mystery. The concept of God being uniform, however, is fundamentally a pagan concept, and that's really where they take a great deal of their information. The concept that a human can be a god is an avodah zoroastric concept. It's a pagan concept which was from the Romans and so on and so forth. And these are one of the things that they borrowed in that kind of sense. They won't go against their tradition because they won't say that Jesus was not a god. And if they cannot be matar to understand how he can be a god. So therefore we see two important things. First of all, the notion that God cannot be three. The fact that Jesus is an Okim is an absolute absurdity, number one. And the notion number two, that God himself goes into the klipa or subjects himself to his own nivra, is also an absolute impossibility. Only his shefa is yearning to something, not the Banishah. Both of these things are absolutely false to begin with. That's why this notion that Jesus is a God, and that God, is machap on the bria by dying, you see, in some way, has no shaykhs with the Jewish concept of the Shina B'Serach HaKlippus. Finally, the Goyim also believe another important thing, that just to believe in the notion of Jesus is sufficient. It's sufficient to what? It's not sufficient just to machapa, it's sufficient to machapa. What is kapora to the Goyim? To the Goyim, to believe in Jesus is to remove all sin. You see, it's mamash to bring you into Elam Haba. You may say, well, if Jesus didn't die for mankind as a God, maybe he died for mankind as a tzaddik, maybe he died for mankind as a Mashiach, or some tzaddik which has to be niskapa, because we find taka by the union of Mashiach ben Yosef that Rabbi Kiva taka died Rabbi Kiva died by the Romans, and taka Rabbi Kiva was Mashiach ben Yosef. So we find that there's an union of Mashiach ben Yosef being niskapa for the Doros. You see, so minimally, why is the concept that Jesus was niskapa for the Doros false? Because it comes to another thing also. Because the essence for a tzaddik dying to be machapa on the bria is that he does not bring the bria into Elam Haba. All he does is bring what's called kiyum of the bria. The only thing that a tzaddik can do by dying for someone else is not to save that person and bring him to Elam Haba. That is impossible. The only thing that can bring a person into Elam Haba is his maisim, is his own yagiyah. Yagiyah is kapot. You see, belief in something that someone else, the death of someone else, could bring you into Olam Haba is not possible. It's an anti-Jewish concept. The notion that a tzaddik taka dies for other people doesn't mean that the tzaddik brings other people to Olam Haba. Of course not. He didn't remove the Midas Hadin. The dying of a tzaddik for the Ummah, for Klal Yisrael, simply means that by taking the neshama of that tzaddik and putting him into the Rishus of the Sultan, that the Sultan is not mekatrig, you see. That he leaves go of the Kittik process. And by leaving go of the Kittik process, it's shayach for Klal Yisrael to continue on, you see, and perform more and more mitzvahs to eventually get to Olam Haba. So the concept of a tzaddik dying for Klal Yisrael is only a concept in kiyum, not in kinyan. A tzaddik cannot be koina Olam Haba for people, but he can be mekayim, he can be matzah people from the kitrug and from the einish of what? Of ibud. That's what the Misa Tzaddikim is. The Misa Tzaddikim is to mekayim the bria from the kitrug of the Sultan, which wants to be ma'abed the bria and see to it that mankind never gets to Olam Haba at all. That's what the Sultan wants. The only way to stop that activity, is how? Is that when the neshama of a tzaddik goes into the klippa and he dies, and therefore he goes into a klippa as such, that neshama is able to give a certain unika to that sultan. And the sultan, because of the way that he's constructed, and we spoke about this before, because he's constructed with an evil nature, cannot see that the unika that he's given, you see, is such that he cannot see that it's a substitute for Klal Yisrael. What the sultan sees is that it's unika, and the sultan instinctively knows that when it takes the Yanika, it stops to be Makatrig. The Sultan automatically knows that when is it supposed to be Makatrig? It's supposed to be Makatrig when it begins to lose its Yanika. However, when it has the Yanika, it no longer is Makatrig. So when the Banishim takes the Tzaddik and puts him in the hands of a Klippa, the Sultan is no longer Makatrig. And when the Sultan is no longer Makatrig, he stops what? The taina that the world should be Ma'abed. And he comes down and he gives Yisurin to the world. But the world should be Makayim through Yisurin. The world will lose its existence. The world would lose if it was ma'abed. So that's what the Misa Tzaddik can do. The Misa of Tzaddik is machapa on the Bria in the sense that it's makayim the Bria. It stays the Bria from the din of Ibud. But it does not elevate mankind into Olam Haba. Nobody can do that whatsoever. So therefore, it is impossible for Jesus to die on the cross in order to bring mankind into the kingdom of heaven, into Olam Haba. Such a concept does not exist in Yadus. In that way. That is another distortion of the entire situation. Finally, what about the concept that the Goyim say that the Banishim left Klal Yisrael and went to the other Ummah Ha'olam? Because we see that the Banishim left the Ummah Ha'olam and went to Klal Yisrael. There are a number of answers to that, you see. And basically, what the basic answer to that is the following. Is that even if that were true, you see, the Banishim would not change another Ummah and this Torah. You see, what the Banishim at best would do would simply say to Klal Yisrael, you don't want to keep my Torah, I will give my Torah to another Ummah, to another nation. They will keep my Torah. Why? Why is it so important to give the Torah? And this is something which we discussed slightly, we'll discuss it in the future shurim. Because the Tayyag Mitzvah is the only way to remove the Sultans from the Bria. The only way that you can masaken the Indian of the Nachash or the Indian of the Zoyam on the Bria is through the Tayyag Mitzvahs. Because the Tayyag Mitzvahs correspond to the Tayyag Avorim. And in that case, the Tayyag Mitzvahs is the only way to remove the Indian of the Sultan from the Bria. That's it. So therefore, if the Banishim had wanted to change Klal Yisrael for another nation, he would not have changed the Torah, because that is the only medicine that's possible. In that sense. So that would have been impossible to choose another nation. But to choose another nation and to remove the Torah, the Banishim would not do, and that's what he told us that he would never do. He would never do that in the Nevi'im. You see, that's one thing. The second thing is, the Banishim had already abandoned the Goyim. He had already rejected all the Ummah Ha'olam. From being the Adam, from being the vehicle to Masakan Olam Haba. Adam Rishon was supposed to create Olam Haba. He failed. And once he failed, his children were supposed to, his toilers. And his toilers were all the Ummah Ha'olam. But most of the Ummah Ha'olam also failed. So when they failed, the Banishim said, you are no longer shaykh to the Pasha of Olam Haba. Only the Zeravom is shaykh to the Pasha of Olam Haba. No longer. When a Klal Yisrael does not do the mitzvahs and wasn't good, the Banishim is not going to say to the rest of them, now I accept you back. The Banishim had already rejected them. The Banishim had already rejected them because of their Maisim Mishoyim, Rishis. And he had chosen the Zeravom. Why would the Banishim go back to the Ummah Ha'olam? Why? Why should he go back to the Ummah Ha'olam and drop Klal Yisrael? Why should he do that? Did the Goyim become tzaddikim before the time of Jesus? No, because the Christians say that the very fact that Jesus came down to the world to mechap on the world is because of the fact that the goyim were at the bottom of the pit. So therefore, what schos would have allowed the goyim to come back up, to suddenly become the Ika Ummah that would carry on the shlichus of Adam Rishon? You see what I'm saying? They've already been rejected before. What schos would allow them to retrieve the originally lost purpose? Nothing. Adrab, they're even more Rishonim. So why would the Banishim leave Klal Yisrael and go to a despised Ummah already, a despised peoples already? That makes absolutely no sense. You see. And that's the Indian, that the Banishim, the Haftocha, to the Banishim, the Avor, by the Bris Ben Absalom, is exactly that you say. That the Bris Ben Absalom said, that when Avram said, B'mo Eda, how do I know that my children will always be the Ummah and the Cheres? It will always be the Ummah that will attempt to do what Adam Rishon did not do, that it will go into Olam Haba. How do I know? Because that's the Haftocha that the Banishim said, the Bris Ben Absalom, that through the Hanukkah HaYichud, and through the fact that Soros and the Chobonis and the Yisuan, I will see to it. You see, that Klal Yisrael, in the end, will be Zercha to Olam Haba, in all cases. But that I will change Klal Yisrael for another Ummah that I've already rejected because they were already tremendous Rishonim, such Rishonim that I had to bring a mabul on the entire Bria. That's totally absurd. And that I should choose another Ummah who still is Rishonim and even worse Rishonim than before? Of course not. This is why, from these things that I'm saying now, this is why the whole concept, you see, that Jesus is either Mashiach or Jesus is Elohim is totally false. Even though Christian theology has certain connections to Jewish thought, in that sense, but we see basically that it's a distortion and a perversion of Jewish thought. And that's why fundamentally Christianity remains a theological doctrine of Sheker. So therefore, to summarize, we see that Christianity is false from 2 points. From its origin, because it goes connected the Masorah of Klal Yisrael, which is experienced by the entire nation, against the Masorah which was experienced by several individuals only. And number 2, theologically it's false. Because once the Torah is emes and the Torah is true, you see, its theology is emes. And if its theology is emes, you cannot create a new theology, a new philosophy to distort it and say that it now replaces the Torah. That's a palpable falsity. And that basically is why Christianity cannot be believed in any sense whatsoever. The question that has to be asked is the following. What is the hashkoch of Christianity? Why is it that at that time, at the time of the Churban Sheni, a new religion started in the world called Christianity, which is the entire matzah of Jesus, and that the hashkoch of process itself, the Banishim himself wanted this thing to be? What really is this Christianity? Why is such a sheker perpetrated for 2,000 years? What tachlis does it serve in the Bria itself? That Esav, which is really, Christianity started in Rome, you see, which is really from Esav. What tachlis does it serve in the Bria that Esav now has taken on such a tremendous thing called Christianity? Because really Christianity is the mantle of Esav. Why? I maintain that Christianity was the undoing of Esav, and its final destruction. Why is that? It's an interesting thing. The Medrash says, in fact, you showed me that totally. The Medrash says an interesting thing that the Banishim says to the Goyim that I can forgive the Goyim for everything that they did. That's what the Banishim says. I can forgive things. I can transfer. I can try and find a way to forgive the things, all the chatoim, the things the Goyim did. Except there's one thing that I can never forgive the Goyim. You see, I can never forgive them because they killed the Asur Uga Malchus. You see, the Asur Uga Malchus. This is a very, very means I can never forgive them because they killed the 10 Tanoim, and the last one was Rabbi Kiva. The Asur Uga Malchus was the 10 martyrs that the Roman Empire killed over a certain period of a certain number of years. The Hadrianic persecutions, where they killed Rabbi Shmuel Kohen Gadol and Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, Rav Chutz, Rabbi Sheva, Rabbi Yudah Mavova, Rabbi Yudah Dama, a whole bunch of them. Rabbi Lezman Shamua, and then finally, and Rabbi Kiva. Basically, there was some more, Hanani ben Tradion and Hanani ben Chakinai. The Roman government killed all of these 10, you see, and these were the greatest tzaddikim in Klal Yisrael. And it says in the Medrash there, it says in the Gemara really, that the Banishim says, I can never forgive the Goyim because they killed these 10 martyrs. The shaila is, what is that meant? What is that Gemara? What is that Agad they're talking about? This is a very, very deep Agadah, and it has to do with some very important meaning of the Hashgacha itself. What was the meaning of the Asura Malchus and so on? In order to understand it, we have to say the following. Right by the time of the Asura Malchus, we find a very interesting thing by the Asura Malchus. What appears to me is that the Asura Malchus symbolized the last entry before the Gullus. The true Gullus, as we know, it started with the Churban Bayesheni. You see, the Churban Bayesheni. And what it was is a very interesting thing. After the second Beis Hamikdash destroyed, Klal Yisrael went to a Gullus which lasted 2,000 years. Now, what is the significance of that Gullus? It is a very, very powerful thing. Because what happened was the following. In the first Churban Beis Hamikdash, when the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, the Rebbeinu Shalom said, because of the kibbutz that comes up to me from Klal Yisrael, because of the Chatoim, especially Ben Adam and so on, what I'm going to do is, I'm going to throw them out, I'm going to take my Shechina away and put them into the Klippa, and I'm going to leave and throw them into Gullus. I'm going to take the Yeruchnias and put it into the Klippas. And the assume that they have, you see, will be machap on the entire thing. But that wasn't a true Gullus. Why? Because it was a Gullus that had a certain end to it. You see, Gullus in that sense was a temporary device in order to raise Klal Yisrael back up to a madrega of schos. It was a temporary device. That's why the first Gullus lasted 70 years, in that sense. But it was hoped that Klal Yisrael would go through the first Gullus, with the first Churban Beis Hamikdash, and then eventually return. The second Churban Beis Hamikdash was much greater. Why? Not only because of the fact that it lasted for 2,000 years, but because of the following. Because of the fact that Klal Yisrael went down to such a level in their Kitrug, where they are, what was decided was that Klal Yisrael would never see the Yemos Mashiach until the Gullus is over. In other words, Gullus, or the Gullus in Esav, became the vehicle, or the vehicle. The second Gullus, the second Churban Beis Hamikdash, was very different than the first. Whereas the first Churban Beis Hamikdash was seen as a temporary device, you see, to be restored, where Klal Yisrael would come back to the kingdom, the second Gullus was seen as a permanent device, where from now on, because of the Kitrug, the only way that Klal Yisrael would ever be able to survive until the Yemos Mashiach would be Gullus itself. Gullus would become the essential vehicle of Avodah of Klal Yisrael from then on. Let's see. In the Churban Beis Rishon, Gullus was not the critical vehicle. It was only one mode or one type of vehicle that the Rebbeinu Shalom would employ. In the second Churban Beis Hamikdash, Gullus became the vehicle. The Yisur and the Klal Yisrael would have to have by going through 2,000 years of Gullus, totally being completely away from Ruchnias and Eretz Yisrael, was the way that Klal Yisrael would reach its Geula. That's the only way. It was a very powerful thing. What the Rebbeinu Shalom said was right before that Gullus, right before the Churban Bayesheni, and before that Gullus, right before the Gullus of Esav would start, when the Tachlis of Esav would start, which was the worst clip of all, what the Rebbeinu Shalom said, I give Klal Yisrael one more chance. Let Klal Yisrael raise itself one more chance. And what happened was, right before the Bayis Rishon, or right before the Churban Bayesheni, there was another possibility to bring the Yemos Mashiach. Another critical period came about where it was possible, you see, to bring the Yemos Mashiach and totally avoid the Gullus of Esav. Because once Klal Yisrael would undergo the Gullus of Esav, there would be no getting out of it. Because the Gullus of Esav has such a quality to it that one would have to be into it for a long, long time. The Gullus of Esav means that the Gullus itself becomes the critical vehicle of Tikkun. That's what it means to have been the Gullus of Esav, which is Rome. But before the Rebbeinu Shalom would put Klal Yisrael into that kind of Gullus, he wanted to give them one more chance for the Yemos Mashiach. That's why Rabbi Akiva and the Dalet Shenichnis the Pardes, the 4 Tanoim who went into Pardes to bring down the 50th Or, the Orish Mashiach, knew that this was a critical period to bring down the Orish Mashiach. They knew it, you see. But they knew that in order to do it, it would have to be extraordinary to do it. You see. What happened? What happened was that Klal Yisrael failed. How do we know that that was the time that the Yemos Mashiach should have been come about? Because in Rabbi Akiva was the Mashiach ben Yosef himself. Not only that, Rabbi Akiva was one of the greatest Mashiach ben Yosef. He's almost the personification of Mashiach ben Yosef. Why? Because from Rabbi Akiva came the entire, basically, Torah Shabbat Peh. You see. From Rabbi Akiva and his 5 Talmidim, Rabbi Meir came the Mishnah, Rabbi Shimon the Zohar, from all his Talmidim came out all the inyanim of Torah Shabbat Peh that we have today. It came from Rabbi Akiva, who was the source. And we all know that the definition of Mashiach ben Yosef is that he is the individual who's megala the Torah, which is shaykh to the generation that have time for its tikkun. That's why Rabbi Akiva was the personification of the Mashiach ben Yosef and of the tachlis of the Mashiach ben Yosef. You see. How do we know, what do you call it, that he was supposed to be a Mashiach ben Yosef that would have been the Mashiach ben Yosef? Because of the fact that there was another man called Bar Kochba. And Rabbi Akiva said that Bar Kochba was the Mashiach also. What was Rabbi Akiva talking about? The truth is that Rabbi Akiva recognized very clearly that this is the Messianic time, and he saw that he was the Mashiach ben Yosef to be followed by the Mashiach ben David, who was Bar Kochba. Bar Kochba, who was the Bar Kochav, who was the son of a Kochav, was the Mashiach ben David, because he was related to David. He's from David. So he should have been the Mashiach ben David. Rabbi Akiva was Mashiach ben Yosef in the sense that he did a very spectacular job. What did he do? Rabbi Akiva began to be Megala in a much greater way the Torah Shabbat Peh. Not only that, Rabbi Akiva, with one of his Talmidim, was Megala something which had never been Megala before. What was that? That was the Zohar from Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai. Before Rabbi Akiva, the Kabbalah or the Pnimis HaTorah in that sense was never revealed to Klal Yisrael before Hesed openly. Never. That light, which had a tremendous amount to do with the Orish Mashiach, was never revealed. It was Rabbi Akiva who was nichnes the Pardes and brought down that awe, the Nun Sharabina, who then gave a chelik to what? To Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, his Talmud, who then wrote the Zohar, which began to be mafalsim this awe in the Bria. You see. So therefore, basically, Rabbi Akiva did accomplish something. Rabbi Akiva in his lifetime was Megala, a certain old Torah that did not exist before. He finished the job. Hence, as soon as he became a Zaken, and when he finished a great deal of what he did, there arose in Klal Yisrael another man, Bar Kochba, who then would have to finish the job by destroying the last remnants, what? Of Esav, in that sense. And that's what he's supposed to do. So Rabbi Akiva knew this. Rabbi Akiva knew that he, as Mashiach ben Yosef, and Bar Kochba and Mashiach ben David, were the team. They were the Trei Mashiachim that would bring in the Gula. You see. He didn't make a mistake. Bar Kochba was the Mashiach ben David in that time. You see. But what happened? The Keturgim on Klal Yisrael did not make it possible. And what happened was that Bar Kochba passed himself to his own gaiva, you see, and in the end, Rabbi Akiva died by the hands of the Romans. Why did Rabbi Akiva die? What was the inyan of the death of Rabbi Akiva? What was the inyan of the Hasora U'Gemalchus? What is the inyan? The inyan of the Hasora U'Gemalchus was the following. Once Klal Yisrael failed to bring in the Yemos Mashiach, right? They won't worry anymore. Then the world is nidun the ibud even more, even worse. When it's supposed to be that the Baruch Hashem wants to grab the entire ore away from the Satan, and the Baruch Hashem is unable to because of the Kitrug, he cannot grab away that ore. What happens? What happens is the Satan is able to grab that ore back, but the acquisition of that ore is so powerful that the Satan is able to run up to the Baruch Hashem and say, "B'makatik on the entire bria," and ask the Baruch Hashem to ma'abad the entire bria, because the Satan says, "Look, you think that your children are ready for Geula? They're not ready for anything. And if they're not ready for Geula, if they're incapable of going through a Geula process, then they should be destroyed entirely." You see, you're telling me that you want to be Goy Klal Yisrael in the end? Fine. But you see, every time you bring them up to Geula, they cannot come to the Geula. If they can't come to a Geula which is sitting right in front of them, they can never come to a Geula. So let's be ma'abad them. You see, that's why the time of the Satan is so much greater when Klal Yisrael fails to bring a Geula. You see. Why? Because the very failure to bring the Geula is the biggest argument for Ibud, because it means that Klal Yisrael will never be Nigal. You see. So what's the entire Tachlis? So the Makatzig wanted to be Ma'abed Klal Yisrael. So what the Baruch Hashem did was, again, he wanted to save the Matzal the Bria. He wanted to be Matzal Bria so that Klal Yisrael can now go into the Golus of Esav itself. You see. But how do you go into the Golus of Esav for a new tikkun, a new kind of kapara? There's only one way. He had to take 10 tzaddikim and throw them into the klip of Esav. The Asura U'Gemalchus were the 10 greatest tzaddikim in Klal Yisrael, and their death at the hands of the Romans, at the hands of Esav, you see, impoverished Esav to a certain degree, with a certain amount of the ore of Esav, which was mekatrig against Klal Yisrael, went back to the hands of Klal Yisrael. It was enough ore, you see, to hold back the mekatrig from tying on Ibud of the Bria. And because of that, Klal Yisrael was then able to enter into the clip of Esav, the Golus of Esav, for the next 2,000 years. Do we see that mechanism? The Asur Arugamalchus, the 10 martyrs who were killed, you see, enabled Klal Yisrael to survive the Golus of 2,000 years into the clip of Esav. Because were it not for that, were it not for the fact that those 10 died at the hands of Esav, Esav would have had such a koyach, it would have been able to be ma'abed Klal Yisrael entirely, you see, as the shaliach of the Makatrik, who demanded Ibud. The only way to prevent that was to take 10 tzaddikim and give some of that all back to Klal Yisrael, so that the Satan would not be Makatrik. But in order for them to take it back, those 10 tzaddikim would have to die at the hands of Esav itself, like we say, and impoverish Esav to the degree where the Makatrik could not say, let Esav come in ma'abed Klal Yisrael. So the best that Esav could do was to what? Was to put Klal Yisrael in Golus. So hence Klal Yisrael went into the Golus of Edom after the Churban Beisheni. So the death of Rabbi Akiva and the death of the Asur Malchus and the death especially of Rabbi Akiva with Mashiach ben Yosef allowed the Bria to go on for the next 2,000 years, so that the Golus of Edom does not swallow up Klal Yisrael and ma'abed them, but simply gives them the amount of Yisum which is necessary, so that they can experience a new Gula at the end of time, when the last time Moshe Mashiach comes. Now, once we understand this, we enter into the Hashkoch of Christianity. The question is, if the Asur Malchus, the mechanism of the Asur Malchus, allowed Klal Yisrael to be Mekuyim in the history for 2,000 years into the Golus of Edom, so the Shaila is, what? So the Goyim looks like Esav does the world a favor. The answer is, of course not, and of course yes. Why? Because the point is like this. When Klal Yisrael goes down to its lowest madrega, the Banishim needs a klippa, a koich of tumah, like we once explained before. He needs an ummah which is even lower, so that he can be makabel Klal Yisrael, so that Klal Yisrael can eventually go up. What the Banishim says is that I needed an ummah. I needed an ummah who was lower than the ketubim of Klal Yisrael, so that eventually they can be minyasa Klal Yisrael and eventually bring them back up. You see, I need an ummah, but which ummah shall I have? Which ummah shall I have? The Buddhism does not choose the ummah chooses itself. This is the point. Which ummah becomes the repository of those oiris to give them back to Klal Yisrael depends on the bechir of that ummah. You see. So fundamentally, even though the Rome and Esav did the Buddhism, the Bria Tova, by being that ummah, they chose to be the worst nation on earth. You see, through their own bechira. So in that sense, it was their own undoing. Because the Buddhism doesn't demand from an ummah to do that, just like by Mitzrayim. He didn't demand that Mitzrayim be the nation that would be Mishabed Klal Yisrael. They did it on their own terms. Even though the Buddhism needed one ummah in order to do that. You see, Rome provided that. But why is it that the Buddhism said, I can never forgive them for what they did? For the following reason. Klal Yisrael, right before they entered into the clip of Rome, reached the lowest madrega. Why was it the lowest madrega? Because Klal Yisrael was ready for the Geula. They were about to be in the Geula, you see. And they lost that Geula. It was snatched for them. Why was it snatched up for them? Because Klal Yisrael already reached a madrega of sin and chinam, of Bein Adam Adam, which was so powerful that Klal Yisrael had gone to the lowest madrega of Hashchosa. You see, Klal Yisrael was in a murdik madrega of Hashchosa by the Churban Beisheni. Terrible madrega. Such a madrega of Hashchosa that they need an ummah of Goyim who were even greater level of Hashchosa. You see, what the Banishim said was the following: I will never forgive you Romans, Esav. What? I will never forgive you because you descended to such a level of Hashchosa where you became the vehicle to give Klal Yisrael its kapora. Why? Because in order to give Klal Yisrael a kapora at that time, in order to make Chaim debris at that point in time, you see, you have to be the most mushchastic nation that has ever been seen before. You see what I'm saying? In order to give Klal Yisrael that kapor, because Klal Yisrael wanted this Wutz Madrega. You, Esav, chose to be that nation. And since you chose to be the nation, that would be the counterbalance, you see, to the Hashchosa that would destroy the Geula. You are the most mushchastic nation that I have ever seen on earth. And because of that, I can never forgive you. The Buddhism says to Esav, to Rome, I can never forgive you. because you have been so low. You have gone to such a low madrigim, tuma and zoyama, that I had to use you to be matzah the bria. Do you see what I'm saying? And that it was your hashchosa and your tumah that was in such a low madriga that I had to give men like Rabbi Kiva and the Asur Malchus, I had to throw them into your lap so that I can survive, so can we survive. You see, this is in the Kuda. The reason why the Banishim was so angry at Rome, you see, is why? Because Rome descended to the lowest level of any Ummah before. And the reason why the Banishim was so disturbed that those Rome destroyed the Asur Malchus, it's not that the fact that Rome killed 10 Tzaddikim. That's not the point. It killed the 10 Tzaddikim who could have brought the Geula, you see. And the fact that those 10 Tzaddikim could not bring the Geula but had to die at the hands of some Goyim, the Banishim needed that to save the Bria. But for the Ummah, you, the Romans, who finally were chosen for that, that was the worst thing of all. Because you were the worst nation that has ever been on the face of the earth, the greatest hashchosa, Ummah, that has ever survived, in order to be Ro'oi, you see, to be that kind of nation. And that's really what it means. What that means is that I can never forgive you Romans, you see, because you were the agent, and you were my weapon, you see, in order to bring the ultimate Geula. But in order for you to be weapon, in order for you to be the vehicle, at this point in time, you had to be the most mushristic nation of all. And that's what I cannot forgive you. I cannot forgive you because you volunteered, and you wanted it with all your heart, to be a nation of such hashchasa, of such gaiva, and such ritzicha, that you wanted the job of destroying the Mashiach of Klal Yisrael. You see, that's what I can never forgive you for. And that's what the Indian is. And in that setting enters the stage of Christianity. Because Christianity was the direct outgrowth of that sinner that the Banishim had for the Goyim. Christianity is the sinner that the Banishim had for the Goyim. Because Christianity is their ultimate undoing. It's important to understand from our continuation about Christianity itself, in terms of the tachlis of Christianity. If you remember what we said, and this is a very critical thing, that the Asur Aruga Malchus, they died, those 10 Tzaddikim fundamentally died, because that period of time was the last time that Klal Yisrael could be zochet to the Moshe Mashiach, to a Nachishena, the last real critical period of time, in the time of Rabbi Kiva and Bar Kochba. It was a time which is very masugel to be the Moshe Mashiach. But Klal Yisrael was not able to bring it across, so what happened was the entire matter went into the Klippas. The Asur Aruga Malchus, Rabbi Kiva died with his Chaverim, and the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed. And basically, since Klal Yisrael failed to bring about the Moshe Mashiach at the time of Rabbi Kiva, who was the Mashiach Renes of Mamash, and who was zochet to the 50th Shahar Bina in the Hachana of being the Mashiach, and the Bar Kochba should have been the Mashiach ben David, so that the stage was completely set. But since Klal Yisrael failed to bring it about, Rabbi Kiva and his Chaverim had to be killed at the hands of Esav. Why? Because now the kittug was enormous, was much greater. Because whenever Klal Yisrael, as I said, comes to a point when the Moshe Mashiach is about to start, and they fail to bring it about, the kittug is much greater, much greater. Because then the Satan says the entire tachlis of Klal Yisrael is to bring about the Geula. That's what you want. Here's the right at the point, and they can't bring it about. So in that case, let's truly be ma'abad them, because they cannot even achieve the one thing that you want them to achieve when they're sitting right in front of it. So the kittug is much greater. So the kittug at that time, Rabbi Kiva and Bar Kochba, at the Bayis Chuk Ma'asheni, was so great that it demanded the ibn of Klal Yisrael. The only thing that can save Klal Yisrael is that the Klal Yisrael and its oris, its complete kedusha and the or, should go into the klip of Esav. And from that point on, which the Romans finally took over Klal Yisrael, and it began the long Golus, where Golus itself will become the main instrument of the Kapora. And that Golus will be represented by Esav, and the Koyach of the Ritzich of Esav. This from now on was a central feature of the Anagas HaYichud. But before this basic mechanism of Golus would come into being, you see, it was necessary to be Maphayis Makatig in some way. And the way that the Banishim was Maphayis Makatig from the Taina of Ibud was that Rabbi Kiva and his Chaverim had to die. And when Rabbi Kiva and the Asur Malchus died at the hands of Rome, what they did was they were machlish Rome. Because they took back certain amount of earth and certain koichas, and the chalisha that they gave to Rome was such a thing that Klal Yisrael was then able to go into the keep of Rome without being destroyed. Klal Yisrael was merely impoverished, the Dalus, when they went into the keep of Rome. But they were not nitzach, they were not destroyed or nevad from that. And that was the significance of their Oga Malchus, their Asura Oga Malchus. The significance of them was that their death was meichen the way for Klal Yisrael to go into the next Golus Esav, which would last for 2,000 years. Were it not for the fact that our Asura Oga Malchus, Klal Yisrael would have been destroyed completely in that Golus. So the fury that the Bonisham has with Esav was that Esav was such a rasha that they were the instrument that was used to destroy the Mashiach and to destroy the entire union of Mashiach of Klal Yisrael itself. You see. And the Bonisham was furious with Esav, Rome, is because in order for the Bonisham to choose Esav as the vehicle of that kapara, that vehicle, Esav, would have to be the worst of all Rishoyim, to such a degree where they were able to become the unique, the awe of the Mashiach itself in that sense, which shows you the hashchosa that Rome had to go on to, the terrible level that they had to achieve to be the proper vehicle for that kind of thing. That's why the Bonishim says, I will never forgive Esav for the fact that it killed the Asura the Malchus. For everything else I can forgive it, but I can never forgive it. And I would like to explain that, meaning that I will never forgive Esav for the level of hashchosa and rishus that it achieved to such a degree that I had to use Esav to totally usurp and swallow the orish of Mashiach itself, and that they had to come and destroy the whole union of Mashiach. I will never forgive Esav for the fact that they have descended to such a madrega, where they therefore became muchan and a ro'ui to be the vehicle of the orish of Mashiach, b'sich ha-klipus, b'sich ha-tumah. But the question now remains, that's what happened to the Jews. Okay, but what about Esav? The fact that Esav was such Rishoyim in that sense. What was Esav's einish? And this is the interesting thing. In a certain sense, Esav's einish was Christianity. Christianity is a very interesting, strange deviation from Judaism. And in a certain sense, the notion of Christianity going to Rome, because Rome fundamentally became the Christian world, you see, and going into the hands of Esav shows you, in a certain sense, why they got that all in the first place. The essence of Christianity lies in two basic ideas. One, that Klal Yisrael is no more the Ummah HaNevcheres, or the chosen people of the Bnei Shalom, but that the Bnei Shalom now chooses the Ummah Ha'olam. And number two, that Jesus represents the essence of the Mashiach, in the sense that he represents the essence of the one who is Machapa on the entire Bria. You see, those ideas are clear messianic ideas and so on. And the interesting thing is the following. Why was Esav Zoicha, or why did Esav have this notion of Christianity, which is a religion based on the whole union of Mashiach, and on the whole union of the chosen people of the Tikkun itself? Why should such an idea come into a religion that has to do with Goyim? Because obviously that was the very ore that Klal Yisrael just lost. What did Klal Yisrael just lose? Klal Yisrael just lost what? The union of the old Mashiach itself. And the fact that Klal Yisrael should have brought the Tikkun at that point. That was the very Nekuda, which appeared right at the time of Rabbi Akiva. So if that's the all that you just lost, that's the very all that goes into the Klippa. And what's the all in the Klippa? That's the Urish Mashiach that's in now in the Klippa of Esav. You see. And therefore, that comes out as the Christian religion. You see, it's an exact turnover. And what's the essence of the Christian religion? That we are now the people who have to be Masak in the Bria. And Jesus is the Mashiach. Not you, and you have no more Mashiach. You see. There's an exact transfer. You see. And that transfer shows what was before Christianity, or why Christianity developed the way it did. Because the very all that Klal Yisrael lost, the Goyim gained. That all, which is now in the hands of the Goyim, is their undoing, and in a certain sense their end. Why? Because of the following. Up to the time of Christianity, basically, the religions of the world were fundamentally those of Avodah Zarah. You see, there was some Avodah Zarah. They were religions of tremendous sheker and tremendous falsity and tumah. It was a whole different thing. It's much easier for an Ovid Avodah Zarah to be Magaya and become from. Why? Than it is for a Christian or a Muslim. Why? Because an Ovid Avodah Zarah can see more easily and more palpably the sheker of his Avodah Zarah. The concept of monotheism is not that far from logic. The entire Avodah of Avodah Zarah, which is to appease the gods, is essentially something which is alien to the human desire or the human need of goodness and simcha and love in a person's life. You see? So therefore, when Goyim, when a Bali Avodah Zarah would come in contact with the Jewish religion, they would see a very startling contrast to what they believe in. What they would believe in is many gods, and gods who are essentially ruthless, and who are cruel, and who constantly have to be appeased. Judaism believes in one God, and that God is not to be appeased, but that God is to be loved and is to be served, to be worshipped. You see, as a version of Toiv, the natural part of a person is to go to that kind of a religion, because that religion, the religion of Jews, is much closer to the Pnimis of Adam. So therefore, it is not that difficult for someone who's over the Avodah Zarah to become a ger. And as we said before, that gerus is the only door which is open to the Ummah Olam to allow them to ever really have Olam Haba in the way of Jews, to become a boiler or constructor. You see. But once Asa became Christian and the Goyim became Christian, that door was fundamentally closed. Why? Because since the religion of Christianity is a total takeoff from the religion of Judaism, and it has many of the principles, in terms of the Messianic principle, the principles of love, and so on and so forth, it is no longer really desirable for a person who's a Christian to become Jewish. Adarabah, you see. Not only is it desirable because the contrast is no longer that great. You see, that's number one. So the motivation to be a ger is now reduced substantially. Not only that, the fact that the Goyish religion is so similar to the Jews, the fact that Christianity is so similar to Judaism in that sense, and not only that, the fact that Christianity remains in a competitive aspect to Judaism, because they are now the real religion. They are the people who are chosen now by God. Their Mashiach is the Emes Mashiach. That puts them at odds with Jews and makes Jews now their adversary in a much more real way. Christianity opposes and is antagonistic to Judaism much more than Avodah Zarah. Much more. Because the existence of Judaism is the refutation of Christianity. You can't have both. They're mutually exclusive. But the existence of Avodah Zarah, you see, does not exclude necessarily Judaism as such. That the two being so far from each other. But since Christianity and Judaism is so close, you see, the existence of now of Christianity essentially it needs to refute that of Judaism. So because of that, it's an einish for the Goyim. Since they were makabel that awe, even that awe is a very high awe, because it has to do with the union of the awe of Mashiach itself, but that awe is, in the end, is a destructive awe for the Goyim, because it makes them almost impossible for them ever to be Magaya, or to really have shaykhs to the Yidden. And not only in terms of Geras, it makes it almost impossible for Goyim now to ever respect Jews, and to realize that the Jews are the Emerson nation. Because even the Shiva Ummah Olam, even the 70 nations of the world, who are higher in the mitzvahs of Benoach, the mitzvahs of Benoach are such that they have to believe in God, and they have to understand that the Jews are taka the superior nation in the world. That's one of the inyanim in the 7 mitzvahs of Noach, is for the Goyim to understand that the Jews are the emes ruchnis, the nation in the world, and that by them being involved with the Jews, it's an aliyah for them. That's the belief of a Benoach. The belief of a Benoach in God is also the belief of the fact of the Jews' superiority as well. But what happened with Christianity is that Christianity also destroyed the possibility of Goyim being true Bnei Noach. Because Goyim now would always hate Jews, and they would always try and kill Jews. Because Judaism is fundamentally a refutation of Christianity. The Goyim, through Christianity, the Goyim have become true enemies of the Jews. That's what Christianity has done. So even though awe is a very high awe, it's because of the fact that the awe was a high awe, and because of the fact that it's so similar to the awe of the Eden, is what finally is going to destroy Esau. So Christianity is the biggest klala that ever came to the world, as far as the Goyim, because it makes it almost impossible for them to be Gerim, number one, and number two, it puts them on an adversary relationship with Eden, and because of that, they distort and deviate from the own mitzvah of Benoach itself. This is the einish of Esau. And then when the Banishim says, I will never forgive Esau for the fact that it destroyed the Eresh Mashiach and took them to its Klippa, that action itself is the churban of Esav. In other words, what the Baruch Shem said is, I will not destroy Esav in my own terms, but the very action of Esav, the fact that Esav usurped the Yerusham Mashiach itself, is their patira. That's their churban, because it will create such a bridge between them and Klal Yisrael that they will never be zurcha to any parsha of Olam Haba. In that sense, you see. So the very kilkul is the agent of Yisurim. The very kilkul, the very tumor, that the very or itself that they robbed from Klal Yisrael is their ultimate destruction. That, I believe, is the hashkoch of Christianity itself, and why it was given to Esav as a einish for what they did to Klal Yisrael. There was one more period of time which was very, very valuable, also in the Yemos Mashiach, and again we see this kind of thing. What we're shown here is a very critical thing. There would appear to be certain critical periods when the Yemos Mashiach could have stopped, and with a very, very powerful light then descended into the hands of the Goyim. And we've just identified one of those lights, one of those periods, which is the period of the second Beis HaMikdash, with the concept of Christianity. Because of the fact that the Yidden failed to bring in the Yemos Mashiach at the time of Rabbi Akiva and of Bayesheni, they lost that all, and that all went to Esav. Esav became Christian, and the Christianity made Esav into an enemy of the Jews. That means that the Jews now would have to suffer, you see, not at the hands of Goyim who are Baalei Avodah Zarah, but Goyim who consider Jews to be the ultimate antithesis of what they are now, which is much worse in that sense. Esav, who's a Christian, hates a Jew much greater than Esav, who's an Avodah Zarah, because it's much more personal now. So it means the Jews now have to be frum, and they have to keep the Torah, they have to be Shema Tayag Mitzvahs in the clip of Christianity, which is much more difficult than that. And I won't go into the experience of the Jews in Christianity. It's a horrifying experience, from inquisitions, pogroms, and Holocaust, and one thing after another. It's an incredibly difficult experience. Around the time of the 16th century, or in the 1500s, another very interesting thing happened. For some reason also, I'm not clear exactly why, the Kufa of the Or of Mashiach was again possible for Klal Yisrael. At that point in time, in the 1500s, obviously Christianity and Esav had so much troubled and agonized Klal Yisrael in the Klippa for 1500 years that the koyach of Esav finally was going down. After 1500 years of Golus, you see, from the time of the Churban Bayesheni until the 15th century, Esav had so pained Klal Yisrael that they were impoverished of the all of Klal Yisrael. So obviously a tremendous amount of the all of Klal Yisrael came back to Klal Yisrael. If a great deal of that all comes back, and that's a long time, 1500 years, Klal Yisrael is now entering again into the stage when it's possible to begin to bring the Yemos Mashiach. That's what it was. But it took 1500 years. Remind you, you see, from the time of the Chet of the Ego, which was in the 1200s, about 1200s BCE, until the time of Rabbi Akiva, was, let's say, something in the area of 1200 years. In order for the Yid to again be zoicha to such a massive degree, such a magnitude, would take another 1500 years, you see. But that 1500 years is much worse than the previous 1300, because that 1500 years is under the klipa of Edom, of Christianity and of Islam, in that way. Whereas the klipa originally was that Klal Yisrael was still in their land, you see, basically, and they still had the Melucha for a long, long time. Where do we see that Klal Yisrael was again zoicha to the Yemos Mashiach in the 15th century? Well, we basically see it is by a number of events. The most critical event that happened in Klal Yisrael at that time was, interestingly, the following. We've said before that the Yemos Mashiach, one of the things that will characterize the whole union of Yosef and Yemos Mashiach is that the entire world will be filled with a knowledge of the Bnei Shalom, a tremendous das of the Bnei Shalom. A great deal of that knowledge has to do with what's called the Pnimius HaTorah. the ability to look into the Torah and see the pneumius, or the inner core. That kind of understanding allows a person to understand history itself, the Hashgacha Pratis. If a person understands that pneumius of Torah, he will understand the science of the Hashgacha. He will understand why the Banishim did many, many things throughout all of human history. That's fundamentally what's contained in that. One of the main things which gives that Chokhmah is the Chokhmah HaKabbalah. In the time of Rabbi Akiva, since the fact that the Yidden was Zocha to the Yemos Mashiach, a certain light of the Pnimis Torah came down and was allowed to be Meforsim for the first time in an open way. That was fundamentally the publication of the Zohar, in the sense of Rabbi Shimon Yochai, that at that time the Zohar was written by Rabbi Shimon Yochai with Hamidov, and it was made Meforsim so that the all that had to do with the Pnimis Torah, which has a great deal to do with Kabbalah, which involves itself with the mechanism of Hashgacha itself. We will not go into that, but the Chokhmah HaKabbalah, as it's known, has a great deal to do with the study of the pure mechanism of the Hashgacha itself, in terms of how the B'nai Shem brings about the various Hanhogas in the Bria. That all came down at that point in the hand of Rabbi Shimon Yochai and was brought out into the world into a sefer called the Zohar. Such an all was never seen in such an open way. But because Klal Yisrael after that was no longer Zocha, that light again re-entered the Klippa and was not seen at all. It was not seen at all for another 1,000 years later, until again it was rediscovered in the 1200s by a man, Rav Moshe Shem Tov de Lyon. Moshe de Lyon, who again rediscovered the Zohar, the Sefer. In fact, there are people who want to say that Moshe de Lyon actually wrote the Zohar, you see. But we have the Kabbalah from the Vilna Gaon, from many great Kabbalah, that it's Rabbi Shimon Yochai who wrote it. But Moshe de Lyon rediscovered it. He found it, you see. He found it. It was lost for over 1,000 years. Yes, it was lost for over 1,000 years. Moshe de Lyon, who uncovered the Zohar, who found it, lived in the 1200s in Spain. He was a Spaniard. He was one of the Rishonim. He found that Sefer, and because he found that Sefer, the Chokhmah of the Kabbalah was again able to be understood. But the Chokhmah of the Kabbalah contains to a large degree the Pnimis HaTorah, but in the form of a mashal, of a metaphor, so that even though it's there, it's still hidden from understanding, because it's written in the way that it's a metaphor, you see, in the sense that it contains symbols of things. It doesn't talk about the actual things themselves, but it talks about the symbols of things which represent the Hashgacha. So to study the Zohar itself is very still difficult to come to the understanding of the Hashgacha part itself and how the B'nai Shem conducts the Bria. But at least they all came out in the form of a metaphor, in the form of the mashal. This came out in the 12th century ACE, in the time in Spain. You see. However, it wasn't clearly understood, and people worked on it for several hundred years until the 1500s. In the 1500s, there arose in Klal Yisrael a man whose name was Yitzchak Luria, known as the Ari. He was a very, very great Mekubal. He was probably the greatest Mekubal ever to pierce into Tanoim. And what he did was that he opened up the Zohar, or the Chokhmah, or the light that was in the Kabbalah, and the Zohar, to give a much clearer understanding of what the Hashgacha Pratis was. He again brought it down because he had the Kabbalah, many things from Gili Eliyahu itself. And he was able to learn many things of what the meaning of the Zohar is and expand on many inyanim which the Zohar itself does not talk about. And fundamentally, his Kabbalah was from Eliyahu Navi itself. That's what we have, the Kabbalah from that time. But he himself was not allowed to write it down. He was not allowed to write it down. He lived in about 1550 at that time. He died at a very young age. He died, I believe, at the age of 38. So he was a very young person when he died. Although he knew a tremendous amount of this Or HaPnimi, of Kabbalah and so on, and he was Magal a great deal to his Talmidim, he was not allowed to write anything down. The only one who was allowed to write down was his Talmud, his biggest Talmud, whose name was Rav Chaim Vital. And Rav Chaim Vital learned by the Ari for only 2 years. The last 2 years of his life, Rav Chaim Vital learned by the Ari. And then after the Ari died, Rav Chaim Vital wrote it in books, which is called the Shemona She'orim, or the 8 Gates. So he wrote the entire thing down in those 8 books, and those books are called the Kitzri Hari. They have all the material of the Ari itself. But even though Reb Chaim Vital wrote down that information was still not published until his son, Reb Shmuel Vital, finally published it. The publication of the Shmona Sha'om and all the Kitzvei Ari, which the Ari had taught many years earlier, was finally done in about 1640. So we're talking about 70, 80, 90 years after the Ari had been machadish, had brought these Nyanim down. You see. After 1640, the Kabbalah spread very rapidly, and it influenced all of Klal Yisrael. In fact, the interesting thing is there are very few things, or very few movements in all of Klal Yisrael that has so affected almost every Jew besides the Kabbalah, especially the Kabbalah Sori. It's an incredible thing that at that time, in the 1640, at that time, the entire world basically was makabel, the Kabbalah of the Ari, as the definitive source for the Kabbalah, which has to do with the understanding of the Pnimis HaTorah, at least in terms of the mashal. It was not the total Pnimis HaTorah, or the true one. It's not the same thing as the total Orish Mashiach, but it's along those lines. It's the beginning of that all. And all of Klal Yisrael accepted it without doubt or problems, which is an amazing thing. I'm not clear why, but there obviously was something about the Ari, and there was something about his reputation, because he was an incredible tzaddik, he's an incredible Kodesh. The Ari many times said that he knew more about what goes on in the Shemayim than he was actually knew on earth itself. His neshama was constantly involved in the Yeshiva Shemala, and the information that he knew was so vast in its information. It's literally something that he said that he could never write such a thing down. That's how much information he knew. You see. And all of Klal Yisrael at that time somehow knew that the Ari was the man. Not only was the greatest one in the world at that time, but it's like Klal Yisrael instinctively knew. Every godly, everyone instinctively knew that a person like the Ari has not appeared in the world since the time of the Tanoim. That's how big he was. There was no Rishon that was bigger than the Ari in Kabbalah. The Ari was obviously bigger than every Rishon. His very Moshe Kodever, the Ramban, the Ravid, all of them. Obviously the Ari surpassed and went far beyond. And the information that he knew in the Pnimis HaTorah was not given to a man since the time of Rav Shimon Yochai. That's how staggering he was. And apparently this was obvious to Klal Yisrael, because they accepted this, Kabbalah, and they accepted this without any doubt that the Ari was this kind of person. So therefore, when the Shmona Shom were finally printed in about 1640, around the time, it was dispersed into all Klal Yisrael. And all Klal Yisrael began to deal with these basic concepts. Obviously, one of the reasons that the Ari was able to obviously come across in such a way, he was a tremendous Baal Mofis. There are many stories about the Mofsim, the tremendous wonders he had the capacity to produce. I mean, some of them almost stagger the mind in that kind of sense. And obviously, he was so free with Mofsim, and he had such a lucid ability, such a tremendous ability to do Mofsim, that he was a tremendous Kodesh in that kind of sense. Among the things that he could do, which is quite well known, he could look at a person, he could look at his forehead, the entire chokmah of the his hand, the way the person, the odor, the reach of the person, the whole shape of the face, and so on, and he could tell you your chatoim that you did in your life. He can tell you the netzing tikkun, and he can tell you the gilgulim from the beginning of the yitzir of your neshama, and he can tell you the progress and what you've done in every one of those gilgulim.
He took his time.
He had the capacity to do this kind of thing, literally. Besides the fact of the ruach hakodesh that he had, but his ruach hakodesh was so staggering that he can see all this information by looking at you once, and he can see everything on your face and everything on your body, and just what you are today, what you were in your lifetime, and what you are in all previous lives. There's a famous Maisa which I once read, which is interesting because there's no suffix. I mean, obviously, by our definition, it's very clear who the Ari was in terms of who his neshama was. But fundamentally, the Maisa was that once the Ari and Reb Chaim Vital, in one of his biggest Talmud, was standing by some kever. I don't know which kever. So the Ari turned around to Reb Chaim Vital and said, it's very important for us to be mispalel on the inyan of the Mashiach ben Yosef, because the Mashiach ben Yosef is in a very powerful sakana, and obviously we know that thing. So Reb Chaim Vital didn't understand clearly what he meant, and so on. And I guess he took the matter somewhat lightly, and in a short period of time later, the Ari died, and he understood very quickly that the Ari was referring to himself as Mashiach ben Yosef, and there's no suffix that the Ari was the Mashiach ben Yosef, for the obvious fact that he fits the critical criteria of the Mashiach ben Yosef is what? That he is the neshama that brings down the Or HaTorah, which is Mesugel, or unique to that generation through its tikkun. And the Ari was the Keli, the vehicle that brought down the Pnimis HaTorah at that point in time. The Chidah says that the Ari was a nitzitz for Moshe Rabbeinu, which is also quite obvious for the simple fact that Moshe Rabbeinu was the main Mashiach ben Yosef in his time. He was the Mashiach ben Yosef, almost the highest Mashiach ben Yosef that ever achieved in that sense, besides Rabbi Akiva. They were all the Mashiach ben Yosef, and they all had that quality. What's common about Moshe Rabbeinu and Rabbi Akiva and obviously and the Ari and so on is that they all Magala, very powerful areas of Torah. In that sense, Moshe Rabbeinu was Magala, the Tayag Mitzvah, the Torah, B'tzuz HaChokhmah, what we have today. Rabbi Akiva was Magala, or not so much Magala, but was the fundamental transmitter of the Torah Shebei Peh. And most of the Torah Shebei that we have comes from him and his Talmidim. Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Meir, and so on. The whole Mishnah comes from Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yudah Nasi was the Talmud of Rabbi Meir. And the Ari was the essence of the Kabbalah in this time. They were all the Mashiach ben Yosef. All the Mashiach ben Yosef. And in that sense, Rabbi Chaim Vital took over the next thing, and so on, but he obviously wasn't aware, so this was the thing, this obviously Meister shows us that Ari was clearly the Mashiach ben Yosef, and as a result, he was a nitzitz of Moshe Rabbeinu. So therefore, we see that the Ari was such a figure that all of Klal Yisrael was Makabel, the Kabbalah, as the Or Pnimius, the beginning of the Or Mashiach, in that sense, in that way. Now, about 20 years later, something very strange happened in Klal Yisrael. After the Sforim of the Kisvei Ari were published in 1640, around that time by Rabbi Shmuel Vital, about 20 years later, something very strange happened. What happened? There arose in Klal Yisrael a man called Shabtai Tzvi. And what happened is a very strange thing. Shabtai Tzvi was obviously a Mekubal. He was a very great Mekubal. And what Shabtai Tzvi was, he learned the Kabbalah Ari, and so on. But Shabtai Tzvi was obviously a disturbed individual, in certain ways, from what I've read. And there seemed to be some profound psychological disturbances, which seemed to border on something called manic depressive illness. In any case, what happened with Shabtai Tzvi was that Shabtai Tzvi came to Eretz Yisrael, and he heard about a man in Eretz Yisrael who was called Nosson of Gaza. And Nosson of Gaza somehow got himself a reputation as being a shtik bal moifus, or a person who had ruach kodesh in that kind of way. Where he took his kodesh from was something else. I guess we know that now. But he seemed to fundamentally use Kabbalah Maisius or certain kodesh that he was able to do certain things. So Shabtai Tzvi came to him, to Nosson of Gaza, and I guess he explained to him the situation of himself and some of the problems that he was having. For some reason, Shabtai Tzvi seemed to have very strong, powerful depressive bouts, depressive periods, where he became very deeply depressed in certain ways. And I guess he could not explain what this was all about. So he told us to Nosson of Gaza, and Nosson of Gaza basically said to him, the reason why you have all these things is because you are the Mashiach. So, from that point on, with those two, began to develop the whole concept that Shabtai Tzvi was the Mashiach. You see. And this went on for a while, for 2 years, and so on. And in an amazing way, which has never really happened to Klal Yisrael and such a thing since the time of Bar Kokhba, the possibility, or the belief that Shabtai Tzvi was the Mashiach, you see, seemed to move rapidly throughout Klal Yisrael like a very powerful wave and storm.
Can you imagine?
You see. Now, why that should happen at that period of time is difficult to say. You see, I don't want to go into the historical aspects, the fact that Klal Yisrael was on the way to the Gesurin, they had just finished the pogroms, the Chamenyaneki pogroms, and so on. They could have been very much Batzah, they were looking for Mashiach, the fact that the Kabbalah was around and so on, and that there was a very strong fervor, messianic fervor and so on. Whatever the story was, Shabtai Tzvi seemed to really, was able to promote this concept with Nosson of Gaza, that he was the Mashiach,